I'm absolutely shocked that some of my videos have been called too edgy, too on the risky side of things. I got in trouble because people were upset that I was blogging versus just doing the standard content that I do so often. I've gotten in trouble because I told people that I don't like Bitcoin, which I don't think is that controversial at all. However, in this video, I'm going to be talking about abortion. And the reason this is happening is because there's a law that was recently passed in Texas, and it doesn't let law enforcement enforce a ban on abortion, but it lets private citizens sue clinics that are performing abortions. This has got the internet all up in arms, and I'm gonna piss people off even more because I'm not going to fall on one of the two primary sides. I'm not gonna say I'm anti-abortion. I'm not going to say I am anti-choice. Are those even options? I mean, it's pro-choice versus pro-life, which don't seem to be the same argument. I guess I'll talk about that later. But there's really three kinds of people in this. There's the people that are really dogmatic. They've decided, I am definitely this kind of person that says you shouldn't be able to have an abortion or you should be able to have an abortion. It's my body, my choice. That side of it where they're very just, I've set my ways in this. And every single one of those people is gonna be mad at me because I'm not going to take your side on either of those. And I know that that's going to make everybody upset. The other side of this is going to be people that are really indifferent. They look at it and they go, oh, this is too complicated. It makes people upset. I'm not going to dive in. I get that. I totally understand that. I kind of respect that to a degree. They say, you know, there's certain battles for me to fight. And this is not one that I want to get into. And then there's the third kind, which is me, the person that goes, I don't know, but I'm trying to figure it out. I'm trying to figure out what the right thing is. So I want to discuss how complicated this issue is from both sides and how it's a really difficult thing to get your head around. So I'm looking for a solid solution. But like so many things that fall on a spectrum, it's really hard to figure out where I sit with this. So the classic arguments in favor of abortion is that a fetus is not a person. They're basically saying my body, my choice, which is totally fine and makes complete sense to me. In Freakonomics, fantastic book by the way, they make a really powerful argument saying that the reason that crime dropped in the 90s was because people were allowed to get their kids aborted, which led to less single family households, which led to less bad kids and lowered the crime rate, which is a fascinating argument in favor of abortion. The author Murray Rothbard, who's absolutely famous among libertarians and people that are interested in freedom, he makes a powerful argument regarding abortion saying that your body is your property and therefore if somebody were to enter your house, you have the right to evict them from your house. And if your body is your property, then you have the right to say this baby is trespassing in my property. A weird argument, but it's kind of interesting and a different take on it. Now there's also arguments against this, of course. Those all boil down to the idea that if a fetus is a baby, then you are committing murder against that, and that's a really hard argument to overcome. I mean, who wants to kill babies? That's awful. But there actually is some data that kind of supports this in the idea that if I were to get into a car accident with somebody and I killed a pregnant woman, I'm actually on the hook for 2 counts of vehicular manslaughter and not 1, which definitely implies that a fetus is considered a person. But again, the problem comes down to, is it pro-choice or anti-choice? Or is it pro-life or anti-life? People are arguing on 2 sides of things that aren't even related at all. Nobody seems to be arguing for the idea that they are anti-choice. Nobody seems to be arguing for the idea that they are anti-life. And because of that, 2 different sides are warring in a fight that doesn't seem to be on the same ground. Everybody's playing a different game here. Everybody is pro-choice, everybody is pro-life. Of course they are. There's also a great deal of hypocrisy going on because a lot of the people that are claiming that they are pro-choice, people that are considered a little bit more liberal, are also fighting to say, hey, you don't have a choice on wearing masks or not during this time of a pandemic. They're saying, you know what, you're impacting other people's lives, and because of that, you should be forced to wear a mask, which is the opposite of the argument of my body, my choice. And you could claim that impacting other people's lives is also an effect that happens when somebody chooses to have an abortion. So there is a hypocrisy there. And the left has the same hypocrisy because people that are conservative are often in favor of the death penalty or often in favor of some of these long-term wars that we've been fighting. So when they're saying they're pro-life and yet they're supporting a death penalty, that seems hypocritical as well. Ultimately, the argument is going to come down to when does life actually begin? And that's a really hard question because when life begins is going to justify exactly when it becomes murder or when it becomes, hey, I'm just removing a couple cells in my body. Nobody argues that it's bad to pop a pimple. If you're just taking out a couple of cells in that pus that comes out, no big deal. It's not, I'm not comparing a baby to pus, by the way. But my point is, you could remove cells. If I rub my arms, I'm removing some skin cells. Nobody says that that's a bad thing. But when it becomes a life, then it becomes problematic and it becomes a bigger discussion. So when does life begin? Some people are arguing that it's at conception. This is going to be when the sperm reaches the egg, boom, you got some new DNA that takes place. This is a powerful argument because people are saying, well, it's new, it's something that hasn't existed before. We've got a new series of code. Now the code is just a cell or a series of cells, a few cells. However, I would argue against this being a form of life because I could take computer code and change that computer code up, and it doesn't mean that that computer code is new life. I don't think conception is the point of life. The second line that people seem to draw in the sand is when there's an electrical activity inside of the embryo. And this happens at about 6 weeks, 5-6 week mark. And this would be the flutter, which people will often refer to as a heartbeat, but it's not really a heartbeat. The heart hasn't fully formed at this point. Or they'll refer to this as a kind of brain activity, but really it's just electrical activity happening in their body. Now, for me, this is a very compelling argument because we pull the plug on people in hospitals when we see no electrical activity in their brain. We call them a vegetable. We say it's okay to let that person go at that point when they don't have any brain activity, any heart activity, when they're basically dead but on life support. So if we're willing to kill somebody at the end of life based off of the fact they have no brain activity, then it seems like that would be the same line that we should draw at the beginning of life. We could say that's our definition of life. But other people don't believe that's a good definition. Other people believe that maybe it's when the embryo becomes a fetus. Oh my God, the flies are killing me here. Boy, I should really be careful about saying the term killing me on a video about abortion. So an embryo becomes a fetus at around the 8 to 12 week mark. The actual heartbeat of a baby is around 10 to 12 weeks. A baby can survive outside of a mother at 21 weeks. Does that mean that that's the point that it's alive? Well, a lot of people will argue that. They'll say 21 weeks should be the mark that we accept. But that is always going to be receding because as technology advances, we're going to find ways of making fetuses or babies or whatever we want to call them, embryos, survive earlier and earlier and earlier in life or in their growth. And so if you say 21 weeks, well, who knows what scientific advancement is going to let us do it at 19 weeks? And then have we just drawn an arbitrary line in the sand? Other people say that it should be all the way up until birth. So, 36 weeks, which becomes a little bit more extreme because the baby could survive outside of that person at that point. But there's even people that advocate for after birth abortions, which is another term for infanticide. There's actually a journal of medical ethics that wrote a paper called After Birth Abortions, making the claim that essentially there is no difference between a newborn and a fetus. And if those two things are the same, then there's no ethical problem in aborting a newborn baby, which I think there clearly is. There's also the Virginia governor, Ralph Northam, and I have exactly what he said on a radio program where he described an after-birth abortion. He said, if a mother is in labor, I can tell you exactly what happens. The infant would be delivered, the infant would be kept comfortable, the infant would be resuscitated, if that's what the mother and family desired, and then a discussion would ensue between the physician and the mother. He's basically saying they would deliver a baby and then choose whether or not to end the baby's life, which sounds really, really dark to me. But another thing that is not brought up very often is men's rights within this. It's always a woman's rights. It's always a woman's right to choose. And I'm not opposed to women having reproductive rights. Of course not. Nobody is, I don't think. And maybe some religious groups are, but I am not in that camp. However, what seems to be dropped off is men's rights. Men don't seem to have any reproductive rights, given the fact that once a woman is pregnant, it's all in her hands. And if a woman has the right to abort her baby at any given point, and the man wants to have a child, ultimately that man has no choice in whether he's having a kid or not. Now, some people will argue that a man's choice comes when he chooses to have sex or not. And that's valid, but then you could say the same argument for women. You could say, well, a woman's choice is when she chooses to have sex or not, and that would remove abortion off the table. So if we have that technology to end a pregnancy, whether it's a morning after pill, whether it's an abortion, whatever that case may be, is this only a tool that is allowed to be used by a woman? And if so, if she is the arbiter, if she is the only person that gets to make a decision on whether a new life begins or doesn't, then a man actually has no reproductive rights. He doesn't get to decide whether a life begins or not. And if you don't have a say in that, then you don't have any responsibility in it as well. You know, as our founding fathers said, no taxation without representation. Men are forced to pay for 18 years of life for a child that they may not have any say in whether it is born or it is not born, and that seems inherently wrong to me. Now, this country was founded having multiple states, with the idea being that each state could kind of choose their own laws in the way they wanted to enact them, and it was kind of an experiment. And unfortunately, it's fallen apart because everybody has deferred to the federal government, which was supposed to be the weakest side. The local government was supposed to be the strongest side. That was supposed to be where all the big decisions were made, and the federal government was mostly there to align things. And until 1913, when they started charging tax and they grew into being the largest government in the world, well, then they took over and they started handing out funds to states where they use it for education and for healthcare. And now all the states seem to be at the behest of the federal government. So unfortunately, because of that, we look to the federal government and try and unify all the states, when in reality, some of the best innovations, some of the best advancements we've had as a country has come from a single state stepping out and saying, I'm going to try something different. One example would be Denver, where they legalized marijuana. And they did that, and every other state was like, this is insane. I can't believe you would do this. A lot of people were protesting. A lot of people were angry about it. And it turned out to be a really, really good thing that has been replicated over many, many states and is soon pretty much inevitably going to become legal on a federal level. So should we let an individual state kind of do what they want, provided that we're not limiting somebody's ability to cross state lines and make their own choices? I think there's an argument to be had there. But ultimately, do we want to make decisions on a collective basis or on an individual basis? Because if we make them on a collective basis, if we say this is what is going to be right for all people, then we have to assume that who's ever making that decision is going to be able to decide what is also right for us as a person. And that's going to be a very, very difficult pill to swallow when it doesn't align with our values. So by forcing our values upon other people, we set ourselves up to risk a situation where they could enforce their values upon us. Maybe a better strategy is to encourage and support the fact that every single person needs to make their own decisions for themselves. And that might mean that you don't agree with somebody who chooses to do something with their body, or who chooses to have a belief system that you don't align with, or chooses to vote a certain way. So ultimately, it comes down to whether we want to live in a collective system or whether we want to live in a personal system. A collective system, collective decisions would mean that we all decide together on what we want. But ultimately, we're not all going to align. There's a lot of people that are considered liberal, there's a lot of people that are considered conservative, and we don't align on that. And so we tried this democratic process where we're saying, hey, who wants it the most? Who is the most popular? The problem is when you're split right down the middle of something like that, you're imposing your viewpoint upon a bunch of people that don't necessarily align with it. And that means that you would have to accept, when your viewpoint is the minority, that those people could inflict their viewpoint upon you. Imagine if you just said, hey, everybody can go out there and vote on what kind of shoes I'm going to be wearing. Well, you might not like the shoes you end up getting. That's why I think personal decisions is the way to go. But for that, you have to be very, very tolerant, very understanding of other people's choices. And that's really hard for us to live by, because we want to align, we want to fit in, and for that we want conformity. We want everybody to be just like us. And maybe it takes greater strength, greater maturity, greater responsibility to say, I'm okay with everybody not being just like me, and them making their own choices for themselves.